Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sister Janet Eisner, President of Emmanuel College, and it's a privilege to gather with you for an extraordinary discussion with one of the world's leading visionaries in business and the life sciences, Dr. Noubar Afeyan. Joining us are members of the Emmanuel College community, as well as dignitaries from organizations including biomedicine, finance, architecture, real estate, philanthropy. We're so honored that you are here with us. This special event is part of a series sponsored by the Emmanuel College Business Collaborative. Led by Associate Dean of Business and Management, Anne-Marie Pasquale, the collaborative blurs the lines between the classroom and the real world, equipping students with the analytical tools and decision-making skills to serve as effective and ethical business leaders. I'm especially grateful to Anne-Marie for serving as moderator for this afternoon's discussion. Emmanuel's programs in the sciences have grown dramatically in scope and reputation over the last few decades. Today, our faculty, in collaboration with students, are conducting world-class research, and our graduates are entering prestigious graduate programs locally and throughout the country, often aided by the internships that you have had at our neighboring Longwood institutions. What is more, as a Catholic college rooted in the liberal arts and sciences, Emmanuel stands at the crossroads of timeless values and the critical issues of our time. All of which is why we are especially eager to hear the perspective of our distinguished guest. Dr. Noubar Afeyan is founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering and co-founder and chairman of Moderna, a Cambridge-based company that changed the world by developing a revolutionary vaccine for COVID-19. Dr. Afeyan holds a PhD in biomedical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is a member of the corporation of MIT, the Institute's governing board. Throughout his impressive career, Dr. Afeyan has co-founded and helped establish over 75 life science companies, demonstrating his commitment to improving the human condition through science and business. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Noubar Afeyan.
Thank you, Sister Janet, and welcome, Dr. Afeyan. Thanks for taking the time to come to Emmanuel College here today. Our students are interested in hearing about your success, your thoughts on innovation and investing and entrepreneurship. So I'll ask some questions, and then after a little bit we'll put it out to the audience. How's that?
Super, great to be here.
So our students come from many different family backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about your own?
Sure. So I was born in Lebanon of Armenian descent. It was a great place to grow up till I was 13 years old, except for a minor problem, which was the Civil War broke out. And the Civil War, when you're 13 years old, kind of takes what you see in movie theaters and brings it to the streets, not in a way that you'd like. For a period of several months, we were going in and out of bunkers. We would see rocket fire across from our balcony where I lived in Beirut. A lot of people died. The building next to us completely collapsed. And after that, my father fortunately decided that this would probably not end very soon, and so he moved our family to Canada. Canada was generous enough to take us essentially as political refugees, because it wasn't like they would allow anybody to just leave every country and go anywhere they want. So we were fortunate. Overnight, I got to see snow. I had never seen snow before. If you grew up in the Middle East, that's also something you see on television. So I grew up in Montreal from that age through college, which was a good kind of, in hindsight, I realize now it was a very important experience because it forced me to adapt to a completely different life suddenly. And then from Montreal, I came to MIT to do my PhD. And essentially, since 1987, I've been involved in starting companies and innovating in the life sciences. I continue to have some level of involvement with my kind of ethnic background as an Armenian. Armenia is a country that 30 years ago found some form of freedom from the Soviet Union, and it became a really poor country again, but a free country somewhat. And so I've been involved in the last 20 years alongside my work at Flagship and doing a lot of philanthropic projects there, development projects there, which has also been an interesting juxtaposition with doing startups in the US and country development halfway across the world, because you realize that, kind of dealing with poverty and food insecurity and many other big issues is a very different thing than developing scientific breakthroughs and things. But then at some level in the last year, which we can come to, the pandemic has kind of almost brought that level of desperation to the whole world. And so it's been an interesting merger of those two threads of my life, suddenly going from thinking that humanitarian work is only done in certain places in the world to realizing that humanitarian work is needed everywhere under certain circumstances. So anyway, that's a little bit of background on it.
So it sounds as if, or you could tell us how your immigrant experience has influenced this path you've taken. Would you say it's had been a strong, powerful influence in your path?
It's had a powerful influence on my path, but less consciously until a few years ago. So I would say, that a few years ago, actually, I was honored by the International Institute of New England. They have this thing they do. It's the first time I ever, except getting an honor, it was nothing to do with the pandemic. It had to do with just all the work I've done with issues, again, issues of immigration. And it just started reflecting on how important it has been in hindsight in my life. I remember, so if you have an immigrant experience, you always feel like an outsider. And so in this country, I came to this country because I wanted to be in this country. It's not because I was born here. And that's a very different level of commitment. And so I remember coming to MIT, and in the first few weeks, I remember in hindsight this poster that was on their infinite corridor, this long, very iconic thing at MIT. And one of the student posters basically was this Indian chief since 1983, facing you with a finger out saying, "Who are you calling foreigner, pilgrim?" And I remember walking by there every day thinking, what is that? And then I realized after a while, in thinking backwards, that it's a really important part of being an American to actually realize that we're all pilgrims, basically, and that is the regenerative power of this country. And I thought a few years ago we were beginning to lose that, because we were beginning to realize that, that was then, but now it's different. It's not. And so I started speaking out a lot more about the need to kind of find ways that we can fairly bring people into our country's kind of idea pool, kind of in the form of ideas, approaches. And so I think that's one of them. The other way it's helped me, which I can go into more if interesting, is that over time I've realized that there's a mindset an immigrant has to have to survive that actually is very, very similar to what innovators need and what entrepreneurs need. Because if you think about it, if you're going to innovate, you're leaving the bounds of what's preceding you. You're attempting to do something that everybody thinks is crazy. People kind of look at you funny, they make fun of your accent, metaphorically, meaning that you're saying strange things to them. But if you insist and you persist and you adapt and eventually you break through, you then become the native of the new way. And that same journey that immigrants go through to adapt and to kind of become part of the new reality is what innovators do. I actually think that innovation is basically intellectual immigration. And I think, physically you may not want to immigrate because it's a great country, you don't want to leave. But intellectually, I think everybody can basically adopt an immigrant mindset. What does that mean? You don't take anything for granted. Nothing is owed to you by your country. When you're an immigrant, nothing is owed to you by your host country. I mean, you just don't take anything for granted. You find everything a little bit uncomfortable, just constitutionally, because you don't fit in. And those are great things as an innovator. And I do think that, one of the things, this may sound controversial to you, but several years ago when there was this intensifying crisis in the country about whether our own country was being left behind, certain places in the country while other places were advancing. I actually think, ironically, that what we need is an immigrant mindset across our whole country. Not just in immigrants, but everybody. Because what that means is you have to be able to put in the effort, put in the survival kind of risk-taking to be able to advance and not wait for the country to do it. And so those are all things that I just find interesting parallels, and I hope at least that point of view, together with a lot of other points of view, make for a better country.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of risk-taking, you started your first company when you were 24 years old. So what or who inspired you to take that chance at that young age?
So I'm very happy to tell you the story, which I've said many times, because I was probably the age of many of the people in this room, and you never know what chance event causes you to kind of completely change the arc of your life. So in my case, I was 22 years old, and I was doing my PhD, and I happened to be sent by folks at MIT to Washington, D.C. for an NSF, National Science Foundation conference. And the conference was not about any particular field, it was about competitiveness. So this was the time when everybody was afraid in the U.S. that Japan was going to overtake the U.S. in technology, and there was a lot of fear. Excuse me. So I ended up going to this thing as kind of a token biotechnology person, because biotechnology was a 5-year-old field at the time. There weren't that many people that could go and speak on behalf of biotechnology. So I went there, and by chance, at lunch, I sat next to this gentleman, this big, physically big person, my father's age, and I asked him what he did, and I mustered enough courage to do that. And he said that he and another friend of his had graduated as a first generation of engineers called electronic engineers, eventually became electrical engineers, and that they didn't know what to do when they graduated. And so they decided that all their friends were going to design these analog circuits. And they thought, well, why don't we make instruments for their friends, basically, to be able to do whatever they do with electronic engineering. So literally described this like this, and they invented these oscilloscopes. And in a garage, they started making them, and then they eventually created a company. This was now in the 40s, late 40s, And so I listened to the story, and I was thinking in my mind, well, I'm a new breed of engineer, biological engineer. There's no instruments to do what my colleagues were doing. There's going to be need to make all sorts of new instruments. So I started imagining pretty linearly that maybe this is something that I could do. I wasn't looking for a job. I was not really far along with my PhD, but it was kind of an interesting story. So eventually I said to him, I kind of asked him what his name was, and it was David Packard from Hewlett Packard. And literally he was telling me, this is before the book The HP Way was written, and he was telling me how they started. And what was remarkable was that he was just, that's the thing that stuck with me, is that he's just a regular person. And unlike, I play basketball, unlike when you see, these phenomenal basketball players where you just physically realize you cannot do that. There was nothing he was saying to me that I thought I couldn't do, because this was not physical, it was intellectual, it was hard work, it was risk-taking. So but the fact that he presented it to me in this kind of unintimidating way, we're kind of like, hey, you could, and I said to him, well, what would it take to do this? And he said, look, I said, like, people tell me I need a product, I need a technology. He said, you don't need those things. If it's a brand new field, you just dive in, whatever you do will be valuable. You'll find your way, so don't get too obsessed over having the best idea. Just kind of like announce yourself in it, whatever you invent, you can cut. So, and I took a lot of courage from that. I talked to him for a couple of hours, came back, started taking courses. There weren't courses in entrepreneurship back in the mid-'80s. There weren't courses in lots of things. But I kind of got a little exposure to technology, management, innovation, isn't it? And then I started a company in '87 when I finished my grad to do exactly what he was doing, make instruments for the biotech industry. And along the way, learned kind of by doing. By '89, '90, the company had begun to make actually and sell products, instruments to separate proteins, mass spectrometry instruments to analyze them. These are all breakthrough things at the time. And that company grew to be a pretty sizable player. We were about 110 million in annual revenues at the end, about 900 people, public for 5 years. And that's kind of, for the first 10 years of my career, that's how I learned how to do kind of what I call startupology. Because sometimes this whole startup world is taken a little too seriously, and like astrology, I kind of sometimes want to kind of remind people that there's a lot of stuff in there that's just kind of you learn by doing, and so those were the early days.
Yeah, so as one of the first PhDs in this new field of biotechnology, did you have any envision what this industry was going to become or where it would go?
Not really, and certainly not precisely. And maybe I can come back and say what I mean by precisely. So I'd say it was clear that the pharmaceutical industry had developed in the prior 50 years based on the chemical industry. So, in world wars, people were beginning to use whatever chemical they could to fight diseases. Initially used to be dye-based, and eventually started becoming antibiotics from nature. And then the most recent approach to pharmaceuticals in the 70s were kind of synthetic chemistry, just kind of made up substances. And we were just beginning to find out how our body works at the molecular cellular level. I mean, literally none of this was known. Even in the early 80s, you knew 2 or 3 important proteins, but you didn't know that there's 100,000 different proteins, that cells do what they... So you could imagine that as this was becoming deciphered, more and more knowledge about diseases could lead to more and more discoveries of drugs. But that's about the level of specificity that I could imagine. What's happened in the 34 years since then was quite unimaginable. But it did tell me that at the end of the day, if you're at the frontier of a space that's just opening up, it will likely go that way, especially if it's got impact on the world the way saving lives does, or helping people live better lives. That's a pretty big unmet need, just like carbon, so there's a few areas where major breakthrough or shifts are opportunities, even without actually envisioning how it's going to play out.
So many entrepreneurs follow a path that's called serial entrepreneurship, right? So they move from one project to the next. But can you explain how your approach to entrepreneurship differs?
So, sure. So, when I started out, I spent the first 5-6 years on this one project, and then by the mid-90s, for reasons I don't quite know other than attention deficit, I started thinking, is this the only thing I'm ever going to do? And I wasn't at all drawn to the notion I got to leave what I'm doing to do something else. Because interestingly, when you look at the investment side of the startup world, venture capital, they do many, many things at the same time. And I was always drawn to the diversity, the diversification, meaning your risk mitigation. All of those things were attractive to me, except entrepreneurs were supposed to do one thing for a really long time and sink or swim with it. So even as the first company, Perceptive Biosystems, was growing, I started realizing that we had things in our labs that were basically not going to go anywhere inside this company because it had set a direction and these were distractions. So I started spinning out these things into standalone companies, raising money for them. And so that was kind of a form of what I used to call parallel entrepreneurship. Meaning, as an entrepreneur, you don't want to think of this as a solo act. These are team activities. And so the idea was, could I form teams that could go after different aspects of this? And so I experimented with that. There was a company we spun out called Chemgenics Pharmaceuticals. This was again in the mid-90s. That ended up being acquired. We created a vaccine company back in the mid-90s for cancer. That ended up going public. And so I started realizing that actually you can do this. And the more of this that I was experimenting with, the more I realized these things are not completely different from each other. I mean, there's some core principles. You still need great people. You still need intellectual property. You still need an unmet need. So that encouraged me by 99, 2000, having done 5 of these now, in addition to the primary first company, to create a platform to do parallel entrepreneurship, which is what my current company, Flagship Pioneering, is all based on.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about Flagship Pioneering. Why do you use the term pioneering? Do you liken your scientists or professionals to be like traditional pioneers, or?
Let me kind of step back and say what it is we do, because it's a little bit of an unusual kind of experiment. So there's 2 experiments we're trying to run at Flagship simultaneously. One is, could you create companies through teams, through process, through an institution, instead of through individual startups? That's the kind of regular way in which startups happen. And I don't suggest that it's a better way, it's just a different way. And the question is, if you were going to do that, how would it operate? How do you incent people? What kind of people do you need? So that's one experiment. The second experiment, which is where the pioneering part comes from, is that we realized after doing this a few years that we were able to create companies quite reproducibly, quite effectively, but they were working on things that other people were working on too. And one of the things that I became very concerned about is that kind of the way innovation happens, it's a really crowded space. As soon as one person has a good idea, 70 people are working on the same idea. And I don't for a minute believe that we can out-execute, out-charm, out-sell, out-anything people. So I really wanted us to figure out, can we out-innovate people? And the only way you can out-innovate them is not in quantity of innovation, but in the distance of innovation from what the present has. So we decided to come up with, and we have been working on this for years, a way by which we could make leaps of innovation, not adjacency-oriented innovations. So what I mean by that is we decided that, okay, so the world is exploring whatever is the next likely thing. But there's no way to explore the next thing. The reason is because nobody will give you money for it. Nobody will join your project because it seems way too risky. And yet, if you happen to find something that will be the next thing, then you could imagine it could be very valuable and you could own it. I mean, you could be there first, you could come up with the language by which the world works there, you could patent it, etc. So we needed to create a methodology, which we have done over the years, which some people may be interested in. And that methodology, we think, gives us the ability to dare to be first in category in every single company that we're creating. By pioneering, that's what we mean. Pioneering, in a way, has many different meanings, but the ecological meaning of a pioneering species is the first species that goes into a barren land and makes it inhabitable. It's the same way in which it's used to describe pioneers who are going west, etc. So it's this notion that you're not following anybody into a space, you're the first into the space, and you make it hospitable to others eventually. That kind of idea was very appealing to us because that's how it felt. We'd land something like Moderna mRNA, which I'm sure we'll talk about, was that 10 years ago, 11 years ago. It was a completely unreasonable, kind of detached from reality concept. Perfect for what we wanted to do. Because we thought, okay, if we can bring it to reality, we can pretty much own it. It may not be realistic, in which case that's one of many things we're doing.
Yeah. So your companies seem to focus on health and agriculture, more those that have a societal impact, really. Is that your exclusive focus? Are you exploring any new areas of investment that are outside of those areas with Flagship?
So Flagship, I'll talk about areas, but important to understand that we're not, our firm is not an investment firm in the sense that we only provide capital to the projects we invent, we own, and we develop. So there's nothing external that we are looking for. So when there are these new trends, new companies, startups, etc., we're unfortunately not the right source of capital for them. There's very rich source of capital elsewhere, but that's not us. Having said that, where do we apply our methodology to? And it is in health, but broadly, and in sustainability. We have historically worked in other areas of sustainability, for example, renewable energy, and we have kind of de-emphasized that, not because of the lack of need, but because of the kind of societal impediments to actually be able to make a difference there. It turns out it costs billions of dollars and regulatory changes to enable renewable energy, and so that was a bit beyond our pay grade. Maybe the world needs it again now. In agriculture, we got into this area because it was very much biology, chemistry driven. That's a science we feel comfortable. Those are sciences we feel comfortable. The area which is kind of pulling us into itself, if I can call it that, much more these days is machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's been about 5 years we've worked heavily in this area. We used to work in this area 10, 15 years ago, because this is not a new area. But it's an area that's become kind of much more enabled by some of the deep learning approaches. And we are very, very interested in that as it relates to enabling major leaps. Because a lot of things that as humans we cannot conceive, you can conceive using these systems. And the question becomes, what can be conceived using these systems? Can you now make them valuable, and how do you do that? So we're exploring those, but we're not broadly into technology for the sake of technology. We're very specific to what we'll do.
Yeah. So let's talk about Moderna. I think some people want to hear a little bit about that.
Oh no.
So when you started that company, did you have any idea what it would become?
I think contemporaneous evidence would suggest that we thought it would become a major disruptive company in the biotech industry. The problem was not what we thought, the problem was what everybody else thought. Because what we were saying seemed, I'll use a word that might sound kind kind of crazy, but fantastical, you know, like my
Yeah.
kids use that word. And you know, of course, that is by design. Let me just interject one thing just for you guys to think about, and then I'll come back to it. So I'll make, once in a while I might go on a bit of a rant, so let me just make one small rant here. I did make a bit of an immigrant rant, let me tell you one other rant, because a lot of you are students. So I would argue that we, for a species that wants to solve world problems with innovation, we're fairly anti-imagination. Let me explain what I mean. So we go to school, we gather knowledge, we learn how to learn, we learn reasoning tools to apply the knowledge. But all of that excludes our ability to imagine. In the arts, we're allowed to imagine. But in science, you know, we got to come up with hypotheses that are falsified, that are completely based on the prior hypotheses. When we publish papers, we got to show 75 references of all the other. Where is room for imagination in that? Imagination, if you went to a scientific meeting and said something imaginary, people would laugh at you. There's a good reason, but an analog. Look at literature. How many Nobel Prizes were given to science fiction writers? They're considered unserious people, generally. Science fiction is not considered a big part of literature. That's crazy. Well, not because I like science fiction. I actually don't particularly like science fiction. But as a genre. But what it is that we've been given, as humans, we've evolved the capability to imagine. That's the first step of leaping. The second step is belief. The ability to believe that you'll end. But the first is imagination. And I would argue that broadly our education system roots out our ability to imagine. It discourages it. Because the first question is, why should I believe what you said? Well, if I have to defend what I said and what I said I just made up, then I can't defend what I said. Therefore, I shouldn't say it, lest I look unscholarly. So I can tell you from one person, if you take nothing away from today, ask yourself when's the last time in your regular day you used imagination in your studies, in your thinking about your future. And if you see yourself subliminally suppressing it, and I hope you're not, like, maybe I'm the only one in the room who has this problem, but trust me, growing up, we're all kind of gradually taught not to use that muscle. And I think if we could use imagination, so Moderna was a product of imagination. We imagined, as one of many, many projects we were working on, not the only one, the possibility that there could be, we didn't know how, a molecule that if you stick into a patient's body could make any protein we want. Why did we imagine this? Because we know that every cell in your body has the wherewithal to make any protein it wants. Every protein that it has a DNA code for. So we thought, why aren't we making drugs in our own bodies instead of making them along the Charles River in that big, factory that you've seen, the Genzyme factory? Why? What is that? It's like $1 billion, $2 billion factory to make things that every cell in your body knows how to do. I mean, I'm simplifying. So the question then became, hold that thought. Instead of, how are you going to do that? You don't know how to do that. Why are you wasting my time telling me something that's a fantasy? Fantasy, I'm going to tell you. Just use fantasy. Right? Science fiction pretty much predicts everything that happens. If you go look at it, there's very little that we're doing that isn't in some, I was watching Dune the other day, and I was completely blown away that in 1965, somebody wrote so many things that for 30 years after everybody put into their both reality and their movies, this capability we have. So what you do instead, if you're able to imagine, take this leap, we were talking about the history of this college a little bit, it's a leap of faith, actually. It's an interesting concept, leap of faith. We use this word to mean different things, but it really involves some level of faith in your ability to learn and create value. So we imagined, we said, how would you do it? If you knew you could do it, how would you do it? So we started looking at DNA, RNA, viruses, lots of different molecules. We found out that RNA would probably be the most interesting molecule for reasons I don't have time to get into. And then we said, why isn't this being done? And step by step by step, kind of almost going from the future backwards, right? We started filling in the technological gaps needed to go present forward to where we want to end up. That was what exactly Moderna did. Now, Moderna did this over 10 years, right? So when COVID hit, Moderna was a 700-person company with 17 programs that were already in human testing. So the world didn't know about it. So when they found out about it, they said, what's this company that's never even made a single product? The answer is we spent $2.5 billion, 10 years, 700 people at the end, perfecting the platform that we then had to apply to an unsuspecting virus and hope to defeat it. That's kind of what happened. But the belief was in the platform and in this general idea that there could be molecules that could instruct your body what to do.
So the scientists in the room, or the biologists in the room, wanted to know if you're going to use that platform, the mRNA platform, for potentially coming up with individualized cancer vaccines. So is that something that Moderna would do, or?
So Moderna has been working on individualized cancer vaccines for 5 years and has already been testing it and has continued to test it in humans long again before COVID came.
Okay.
So unbeknownst to people, just because it's not a, it's not Google, it's not Facebook, it's not social media where you can find out what they're doing and the whole world's paying attention to it. We were just doing it in our labs. In addition to that, we had 8 other vaccines that we were testing, our mRNA versions of it before COVID. One of the interesting things people don't realize is that back in 2015, the very first mRNA that we ever tested in humans as a vaccine were against 2 strains of influenza that are bird flu strains that have not yet been in humans. Why? Because we wanted to be ready for a pandemic. Because when those strains get into humans, they definitely will cause a pretty serious epidemic, maybe a pandemic. And so, ironically, we had already tested it, not in a coronavirus case, but in an influenza case. So, yes, we're working on vaccines and we'll continue to. Cancer, both vaccines and therapies, but also cardiovascular drugs. So, right after a heart attack, you can literally inject mRNA for a molecule called VEGF, and that molecule will get stem cells in your heart muscle to start producing new cardiomyocytes, which will be able to get the heart from the damage to become reversed. That's in phase 3 trials, entering phase 3 trials now. Rare genetic diseases, many, many of them. So where this ends up 10 years, 20 years from now, who knows? But I think Moderna said publicly, we have 34 different development programs that are advancing. Probably 5 of them will read out over the next 3-4 years, and then they'll lead to next wave and next wave after that.
Any thoughts on how we can prevent a pandemic from happening, another pandemic, or any lessons learned from COVID-19 that you applied to your...
In 2 minutes. That's right. Hide. No. The only answer is hide. Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of things that we could learn if we chose to learn them. I worry that we won't learn them because a lot of our existence has become so kind of in the moment. The news cycle just keeps kind of like waves washing away the last news cycle, and that's it's very, very hard to kind of hang on to the major learnings. I hope it doesn't happen because 5 million people have lost their lives over this pandemic. The notion that they would just be a distant memory in the news cycle 6 months from now would be an unbelievable shame. And as we sit here today with masks on, it might seem unbelievable, but just you wait, because the way social media works, the way the world works today, people are on to the next problem and the next challenge, and they almost don't want to feel the anguish of worrying about something, so they just kind of erase it. Having said that, I do think that this experience should cause humanity to ask a very simple question, which is, what do we mean by healthcare? What do our countries owe us? And I would argue, just to be a bit blunt, that what we call healthcare is actually sick care. Because the way you know that is that you got to get sick to get any of it. You can't go if you're healthy and say, give me some healthcare, right? They'll just send you home, they'll do a couple of tests, so you're fine, go home. But when you're sick, it's often too late. Because first, you don't get to decide how sick you are. So by the time a disease manifests and all of a sudden you have stage 3 cancer, there's not much we're going to do about this anytime soon because it's a complex disease that's already taken hold. So we got to move upstream, upstream, upstream. The problem is, the more upstream it is, the harder it is to detect. And the harder it is to prove you did something about it. Because it's like your car. Right? If your car is completely busted, then if somebody fixes it, you know. But if it's a little bit misaligned, gradually it's going to cause you to crash. It's very hard to show that what you did actually saved. So that's an important concept. But I'd say in a short kind of summary, I think we need to think about health as a matter our governments owe us the security of, not the care of. So if your physical security in this room is actually a right you have that's being assured by the government. You're paying taxes, you have police, you have laws, you have the military, you have counterterrorism. All these things give you physical security. That's why we can be here today without worrying that somebody's going to shoot us or hit us or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But who's protecting our health? Basically nobody. Right? You could say, oh, but we took childhood vaccines. Just watch how much people don't want to take any vaccines. So health protection is itself not part of our conscience. We could have fluoride in the water. And so people say, oh yeah, does that mean we need public health? The problem with just public health is that that's kind of it's like building a wall, meaning that it's just one size fits all. What I think we need in the future is a form of preemptive medicine. We need to go find the preconditions to disease, be able to treat those preconditions, hold the disease at bay, delay it, deter it, derail it, do whatever you want to do, but don't wait for the disease to take hold. A society that puts money into that, I think will have much more affordable health care when you're sick than a society that doesn't. And we just saw that with the pandemic, right? The biggest thing that the pandemic showed us is that our underlying health condition dictates how badly we get affected by infection. So most of the people who died had underlying serious health conditions. Well, did society actually protect them? Not really. They were, with these health conditions, completely vulnerable to this infection, and the infection got them first. Now, if you're not one of them, you'd say, well, thank God I'm not one of them. But sorry, folks, you will be. Just give it a few years, you will be. Because we're not any more protected from these health conditions than those people were. So age gives you those preconditions, in addition to other things that you might have genetically. So I really, really hope that politicians and universities and the like start realizing that we have to demand health security. And if you said, why the government, why can't private companies do this? The answer is, this is a heavily regulated industry. If you went today to the FDA and said, I want a pre-treatment for a pre-disease, they'll throw you out. There's no such thing. They'll say, come back when you have a disease. Tell me the disease and I'll get a drug approved. Not a good idea when it comes to infectious disease, not a good idea when it comes to cancer either.
Fascinating. So is there any advice you wish you had perhaps as an undergraduate, or any advice you want to share with the students in the room about what they should be doing in the future or just in general?
Boy, my advice is worth what you pay me, which is nothing. So don't take it very seriously. But there's a look. I've already said a few things. First of all, I have a little. One time I was down at Cape Cod in one of these stores that sell these wooden things. I always wondered who buys these things since I thought about them. And one of them says, "Trust your crazy ideas." And I bought this like 25 years ago, and I have it behind my desk because, if you think that breakthroughs come from smart people who have smart ideas, you're dead wrong. Breakthroughs are emergent, and they are the result of many, many generations of iteration of prior ideas, and eventually at some point they gain an advantage, and if you happen to be there, you get to tell the world how genius you are, but it's just not how it happened. So first thing is, you cannot dismiss things that are not beautifully born genius ideas. Every one of your crazy ideas could be the ancestor of a breakthrough idea, but most people abandon them because they look at it and they go, this is no good, let me move on to the next one. So that's one, first of all, that's what I believe. Second is you have to realize that, trying to do new things will expose you to a lot of criticism, a lot of skepticism. Your family and friends will tell you, just go get a real job. And so there's a lot of people who care for you who will tell you not to do this. And maybe you shouldn't. But if you decide to, nobody's going to stop telling you those things. So you cannot feel bad for yourself. That's partly the immigrant mindset. Maybe the last thing I'll say is I've in looking back for many, many years, because I've been involved in teaching entrepreneurship and innovation at MIT and Harvard Business School for the last 20 years, and I've had to, when you teach, you have to think about what you're saying versus just doing it. And one of the things that a lot of times people ask you is, what's the mindset? What's the mindset that people have? And my best description of a mindset, if you want to be in a life of innovation and entrepreneurship, is basically one of paranoid optimism, which is something that I've long thought is important. So Andy Grove wrote this book many years ago, a famous book called Only the Paranoid Survive. But I would say only the paranoid optimists thrive. Because if you are just an optimist, you'll kind of get reckless and you'll believe your own assumptions, and when they're wrong, you're dead. If you're only paranoid, you'll quickly get depressed that you can't act because you don't know if your assumptions are right, and you just can't. But if you can toggle between the two, like a gas pedal and a brake pedal, constantly doubting yourself, constantly believing yourself, constantly and you add a little element of urgency, right? But also patience. And what I mean by urgency is an orientation. Patience is kind of what makes your urgency sufferable a little bit. These are all things that you kind of have to come up with yourself and make peace of with yourself. It's not a comfortable existence, by the way. You'd rather be accepted. You'd rather have people think what you're doing is definitely going to work. You want affirmation. That's the other thing. Maybe the last thing I'll say. I had, unfortunately my kids are not here or watching this, but I had 3 daughters that went down the street to Windsor School, and I used to drive them to school. That was my one luxury of my life, was that I could drive them every day. And I used to talk to them. And I realized as they grew up that one of the things that they were just developing on their own is an incredibly sophisticated system to avoid disappointment. It is very deeply rooted. Like, this is kind of like the evolution of our character, is how do you avoid disappointment? And I realized, in fact, I can't do very much to bring them up well, but that was the one thing I used to do, which is to interfere with that. And I used to basically tell them, disappointment is overrated. Just like, if you collect a lot of disappointment, you're getting one step closer to appointment. There's no such word, but the opposite of disappointment. But if you avoid disappointment by everything you do, you don't take a shot because you don't think you'll go in, you don't try out for a team because you don't think you'll make it, and you just don't want the indignity of being rejected, oh my God, are you boxing yourself into a pretty small space. On the other hand, just ask somebody who sells for a living, right? To me, the most difficult job in the world is salesman, because they're rejected all the time. And what they do is they make peace with the fact that every rejection gets you closer to acceptance. And these are not just kind of like, sayings. This is this reality. So just experiment with it. Find a place where you can do something that risks disappointment, and just kind of like make fun of it. Don't take yourself too seriously. I really, really think that disappointment is overrated. At some point, when you're complaining to somebody about this or that and the other thing, if you just remind yourself that maybe all I'm doing is avoiding disappointment, I think you'll find that new opportunities will show up in your life. And that's one thing that I've learned. And by the way, it's not easy to do. You have to constantly be playing a game with your life, with your mind, of saying, no, don't worry about disappointment, it's okay, the next one. But if you learn how to do that almost as a personal habit trait, I think you'll find pretty interesting decisions.
And I know we have some students that would like to ask a few questions with our remaining few minutes. We just have a few minutes left. So if I may, I think Marlis, do you want to kick us off here?
Good evening.
That's right.
Oh, I can hear you.
Good evening, Dr. Afeyan. First, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for protecting me, my family, and the entire world with your revolutionary vaccine. Now, I believe that core values form the foundation of one's life and greatly determine the choices that one makes. What do you believe to be your core values? How did they develop? And how have they impacted your life story?
That's a tough question. In 2 minutes. Yeah. I don't have a canned answer to that, because I don't do too many of these types of things. And I kind of embody some of these values and what I've been trying to share with you, embody them, but I don't have kind of like a set of 2 or 3 things. But I'll tell you one that I can at least talk about a little bit, which is embodied in a humanitarian project that I started many years ago. And it's the foundation of that, but it's also what I believe, which is this notion of gratitude in action, right? So I feel like everything I'm doing is through the sacrifice of other people. I, for example, happen to be a 2nd-generation survivor of a genocide, right? And it's always, my great aunt that I grew up with from the day I was born until I was 20 years old, basically lived through that, and her brothers were taken away to be killed. So she was first kind of witness to what happened. So happens that my grandfather was saved by German soldiers in the middle of World War I when the Germans were perpetrating and helping some of these activities. Now, what do I do with that 100 years later? The answer is I realized, but for the grace of somebody who helped my grandfather, I wouldn't exist. But for the grace of doctors who helped various issues that I had. So when you realize that you're just kind of enabled by others, you develop a sense of gratitude. And the question is, how do you put that gratitude into what you do, into your actions? Whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through volunteerism, whether it's through just talking to people and giving them your perspective so that it'll open up their minds. So that's one of the kind of values that I've kind of put a lot of at least effort and thought into. But I think your question was more general, kind of like how do I, what do I live by? I don't have a kind of a quickie answer to that, unfortunately, sorry to disappoint you. But I really hope that ultimately what I do will kind of indicate what I believe in, and maybe give it a little bit of time, I'll have a better answer to it next time.
Thank you so, so much.
We're all so happy to have you here and enjoy the whole world, like Marla said. Everything you've done. As a fellow Armenian, I know that you've done a lot of work in Armenia, or wherever you were, alongside with the pandemic. Armenia did go through wars, and there's a lot of political turmoil. Is there any projects you're currently working on, or aid missions that you're working on right now that you'd like to share with the group?
Sure. So because it's kind of a particular question in the sense that it has to do with a tiny little place in the world, but it's indicative of what others can do everywhere else in the world. So first of all, there's a region that is near Armenia where there has been a conflict and a war. And so as a result of that, there was a lot of need for humanitarian assistance. So first, we set up an activity in ARTSOC to provide quite substantial, several hundred projects were undertaken to give people jobs and rebuild their houses, etc. So we've been involved in that. More broadly, though, Armenia as a country is among the very many countries in the world that are in between abject poverty and a little better than that, and they're kind of stuck because they don't have the resources to solve today's problem, and they can't imagine a future unless they solve current problems, and therefore they're stuck. And there, we've done years and years, and we're doing a lot of work now, in trying to work on what could be a possible future for the country, sufficient for people not to leave the country, and sufficient people to get education to work towards that future. So it's this project we call Future Armenian that we launched about a year ago. It's got 15 different goals, just similar to the SDGs of the UN. And we're thinking that we have to kind of find a way to focus people's minds on what is possible such that they can make the sacrifices to be able to get to that. And so some of it is kind of social support, social service, some of it is education, some of it is just jobs, but also equity in society, opportunity. So there's a bunch of different specific initiatives we're taking. Armenia has been an interesting place because it's been a tiny little microcosm of what's possible broadly in the world. And then but outside Armenia, through the Aurora project, and if you were interested in any of these activities, there's a Aurora humanitarian initiative that is global, not just based in Armenia. There, we've been able to reach literally many, many countries with kind of refugee assistance and stuff. So just different ways to, I'd say one thing I would tell people is if you're sitting there listening, oh, wouldn't it be great to have money to give to these places? Money is not the biggest thing I've given to these places. For 20 years, I've gone to Armenia 5-6 times a year. And on the ground have tons of people who are actually working on projects. And the biggest thing you can do is actually personal involvement. In fact, I only generally give money to the things I'm personally involved with. I mean, substantial amounts, as opposed to charity where I'm just kind of, fulfilling a sense of duty I have. But actually, if you can get involved, you can actually see what might be the right ways to go. So lots of different activities.
We probably have time for one last question.
You have to pick one thing, whether it's education or healthcare. It's probably healthcare, whether it's education. I would like to know what you want to give your money to.
Yeah. Well, education is one of these things where there's an infinite number of things that need attention, need improvement, need experimentation. I tend to be kind of more drawn towards doing things in an unprecedented way. I'd say that kind of experiments that have not yet been run, just because of my nature, are more interesting. I think that's so. I've been, as was mentioned, I've been involved at MIT, where some of the things that I've been supporting are, for example, an initiative called SOLVE, which is basically a global development social impact program that brings hundreds and hundreds of applicants with novel solutions to challenges in the world, together with a scientific engineering community who can kind of weigh in on those, out of which a handful of projects are chosen to advance both as an educational tool, real-world problems, solving real, improving lives, but as well a way to create companies or nonprofits that can advance those. So that's been, that's experiential education, but it's part of an educational campaign. But that's so, I mean, I understand the nature of your question. Education is really the biggest gift people can give, because at the end of the day, it's got a very long, in fact, being touched by the understanding that you have to learn how to learn, more so than just learning, is the biggest gift you can give. And it's easy to assume that you gotta just suffer through learning and then be done with it and just live. But actually, what you're getting here is an appreciation of how to learn. And most of what you're going to learn, you will learn outside of here, even if you learn a lot here. And so I think getting that reinforced to people is another important thing.
Thank you very much.
Well, we really appreciate your insight and your commitment to the future of health and sustainability. So on behalf of the entire